I've been reading this marvelous little book by E. Michael Jones called Degenerate Moderns. It's been one of those books that's been filled with kind of aha moments as I've read it. In the book, he's essentially making the case that all of our present ideological woes, the constant pull, at least over the last 150 years, towards secular and leftward-leaning ideas around morality, around social norms, those kinds of things, arose out of a body of thinkers who were largely driven by their own sexual misconduct, their own sexual sins. They thought to justify those sins, to cover up those sins, by reconceiving of certain ways that the universe functions, certain ways that morality functions in the world. He runs the gamut from the British Secret Service in the 1940s to Kinsey and his research at the University of Indiana, to sociological studies that were massively formative in the field that were done in Samoa. In each and every case, he pinpoints the particular sins, the particular sexual immorality of the people spouting these ideas that became massively influential, but ultimately could be, at least in some ways, construed or at least seen as foundationally driven by guilt, foundationally driven by the need to justify their own life, to justify their own actions. Likewise, I try to come back to this book, or at least these few chapters, every couple of years. There's a book called The Politics of Guilt and Pity by Rushdoony. In those early chapters, he essentially argues that all of our political scheming, most of the politics that can be dissected in the last century, were derived from the reality that all of humanity intrinsically knows that it needs atonement. It needs something to deal with sin. We want nothing to do with Jesus. We want nothing to do with Christ and the atonement that he offers. And so instead we come up with massive schemes for justifying our own sins, ways of seeking out our own atonement. This was particularly poignant. I read it the first time during 2020, during everything that was going on with COVID, everything that was going on with the BLM riots and protests, everything that was going on both socially in the United States and politically in the United States. At the root of both of these books is the idea that we need atonement for our sins. And there's a lot of fruit, I think, that could be born by looking at these books and tracing that idea through, whether it's present-day politics or the politics that are about to ensue, different social movements, different things that are happening all around our culture. But there's one particular thread that stuck out to me that from reflecting on Jones' book, but also I was sitting here, actually in this exact spot, on Wednesday night as the women from our church were gathering upstairs. A group of women are getting together to read through Jim Wilson's marvelous little book, How to Be Free from Bitterness, which, by the way, is a marvelous little book filled with all sorts of practical wisdom on how to fight the sin of bitterness and why you should actually be ruthless in fighting the sin of bitterness. And one thing occurred to me as I was kind of listening in on those conversations that were filtering through my ceiling and thinking about Jones' book is how much of our own big ideas, the major fights against culture war issues. So you think about things like feminism or the alphabet army or whatever's happening culturally. We often spend an enormous amount of time thinking about mobilizing our energies to fight at that level, to fight a world of ideas, to engage those ideas politically, to engage those ideas and trying to show what's underneath them. And as I got to think about what's underneath all of them, in reflecting on Jones' book, it occurs to me that so much of what we would say are these big ideas are simply root heart sins that we can find in the scriptures, sins that the Bible condemns, that we've found elaborate ways culturally to justify. At the end of the day, I don't think our biggest battle is to be fought against things like feminism or social justice and CRT. I think those are real battles. I think those are real battles that need to be fought in the public square. They're real battles that need to be fought in public. But I think at the end of the day, like our biggest problems that we have to deal with, that ultimately are the root causes of those larger issues, are things like bitterness. They're things like envy. They're things like pride. They're things like lust. The abortion legislation, all of the things going on in Colorado around abortion, are horrifying, and they should be fought legislatively. But at the root of this massive cultural issue called abortion, at the end is things like bitterness and things like envy and things like lust. At the root of all of our cultural sins, at the root of all of our all of these big, massive worldview level battles, in the end, it comes down to what sort of hearts are we cultivating? What sort of homes are we cultivating? What sort of marriages are we cultivating? Are we actually doing business with those pesky little weeds of sins that grow up in the human heart? It's my contention, and I think it's derived from both Rushdoony's work and Jones, and I think it's found all over the scriptures, is this idea that those larger cultural issues ultimately arise out of individual human hearts that are bent on envy, and we begin to group together with other envious folks and try to find ways to philosophically or ideologically or even legislatively protect that envy, justify that envy, redefine that envy. I think as bitterness gets up ahead of steam, we find elaborate philosophies reconceiving of things like justice in order to justify our bitterness, in order to kind of flip the notion of bitterness such that they become virtues. And I think this happens again and again and again, which is simply to say to all of us, but I'll say the next little part to pastors, like our biggest battles in our churches aren't with feminists. They're not ultimately, I think, with the sexual lobby. I think at the end of the day, the biggest battles we fought in our churches, with individuals in our church, and with our own lives, is going to be fought over issues like bitterness and envy and pride and lust. They're going to be fought on a much smaller scale. Now, I think those battles will need to happen on a large scale, and they will happen, and they are happening on a larger scale. But at the end of the day, those are simply justifications for our own envy, our own lust, our own bitterness. The biggest battles to be fought in our churches and in our lives as Christians, in the end, is going to be wives who are wives who are bitter and envious, learning to come to terms and wage war on that bitterness and envy rather than excuse it. It's going to be husbands who are apathetic. It's going to be husbands who don't love their wives and their children, maybe finding any way they can even work to justify avoiding going home and doing their duties, fulfilling their responsibilities as husbands and fathers. Learning to come to terms with what's at the root of that. Is it lust? Is it greed? What's fueling those things? Like, this is where the battle is. A couple of weeks ago, I preached a homily at a wedding in Utah, and I will have to tell you sometime, if I haven't, about the adventure getting to this wedding in Utah. But I remember standing up at the very beginning of this homily and just declaring to this couple that the biggest battle in our culture, the biggest battle really in the world that's going to happen is going to be fought right there in their marriage. It's not going to be getting the right lobbyists or writing the right books or the perfect tweet or X. I don't know what you call them anymore. In the end, it's going to be fought over a husband and a wife waging war on their own sin and waging war on one another's sin. Recognizing the fact that bitterness and envy takes root, that pride takes root, that lust gets excused, that pride drives a kind of ambition that ultimately makes will either make or break a marriage. And that multiplied times 1,000,000 and multiplied times 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years is what gives rise to what I think is like every single problem in our culture. I think we're all drawn to try to find like the secret switch. If we flip this switch, if we finally disprove feminist ideology, then everything will be fixed. That's not how it works. Those ideologies are ultimately rooted in human sins, human everyday sins. And so the call of the Christian, as we engage in the battlefield that is our day, well, ultimately cannot be won unless we do the everyday, normal, and frankly frustrating and boring work of just naming the sins that are occurring everywhere around us, just right in our homes, right in our own lives, right in our own attitudes, right in every little careless word that Jesus said that we would be judged for. Dealing with those things. It means accepting and believing and being reminded regularly, weekly, daily, of the glorious fact that we are a forgiven people. And therefore, as a forgiven people, we should be eager to forgive others, and we should be eager to seek forgiveness. We've expressed these kinds of attitudes or acted out in ways that accord with these kinds of attitudes. The culture war is about the culture, but it's also about us doing our best in the power of the Spirit and trusting in the work done for us in Jesus to wage war on the everyday little sins, the little weeds that grow up in the garden of our lives and our homes.